Lyme disease, a tick-borne illness that has been claimed to be a bioweapon created and utilized by the United States government. This claim has been made by both a sitting congressman and former presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This is the Lyme disease bioweapon conspiracy theory. Roll intro. 425,000 new cases, $1 trillion on Lyme disease to use as biological weapons. Plum Island, in case they got into a war with the Soviet Union. Tierix, it's profoundly dubious. Experimented with ticks. So what on earth? So before we get into the conspiracy, let's just go over the basics about what Lyme disease is. It's called Lyme borreliosis, I think it's how you say it, or Borrelia burgdorferi is the species of disease it is. It's a kind of disease that's called spirochete, and it's like the actual like disease pathogens are like little spirals. They actually kind of look like spiral pasta. So it's basically when spiral mac and cheese gets inside of your blood and it just wrecks you. And full disclaimer, I've had Lyme disease. I had to battle it. It was really rough. It was extraordinarily painful. My entire body hurt for a couple of months. I had to go on extremely heavy antibiotics for 4 weeks to kind of get it out of my system, and it's really intense. Early signs of Lyme disease from the tick, outside of just noticing the tick, you usually get this like little bullseye rash. I'll throw a photo up of what that kind of looks like. And this is spread by the black-legged tick family, also known as Ixodes, I think, tick, or the deer tick. They have several different names, but they're all the black-legged tick family. And if you ever get a tick, it is best to try to remove it as quickly as possible because it does actually take a little bit of time from Lyme disease to get from the tick into your body. So the faster you get a tick off, the less likely you are to get Lyme disease from a tick. They currently have 2 different ways they can diagnose this. It's either an ELISA test or a Western blot test, and I'm not going to go into those because it's going to get boring. But approximately 425,000 new cases of chronic Lyme disease happen every year in the United States. It's actually a pretty common disease, especially in the really heavily wooded areas of the eastern part of the United States, but it's also made its way into the Midwest and to the California coastline, the forests in California and Oregon. It's present there as well. It's about 20% of cases that get bad symptoms and really mess up your body. The other 80% of people are usually relatively fine. And in the United States, we spend about $1 trillion on Lyme disease treatment and diagnosis every year. Did I say trillion? I meant billion. $1 billion. Trillion's insane. According to a study by DPH, 26.5% or more than 1 in 4 ticks have Lyme disease present in their blood system when tested. So you have a 1 in 4 chance of, if you get a tick bite, that tick is going to have Lyme disease. And like I said, the sooner you get the tick off your body, the less chance of the Lyme disease getting into your bloodstream. So those are the basics. So let's get into this conspiracy theory. But before I do, I'm gonna open up a can of Tixie, made with real ticks. The Pepsi jokes are not gonna stop. They're not gonna stop. This conspiracy theory has come back into the public eye over the past couple of weeks during the hearings of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as he's being potentially vetted to take over like the Department of Health and Human Services and whatnot in the Trump administration. Many clips have gone viral of them questioning him whether he brought this up. Here's the direct quote. Senator Bennett asked, "Did you say that Lyme disease is a highly likely and material engineered bioweapon?" And I made sure to put in the highly likely. Did you say that it is a highly likely military engineered bioweapon? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. replied, "I probably did say that. That is what the developer of Lyme disease said." And then Senator Bennett said, "I want all of our colleagues to hear it, Mr. Kennedy. You said yes." So what on earth is Robert Kennedy talking about? What is he saying that the disease Lyme disease is a bioengineered military weapon? Well, let's jump back 6 years into the past when the last time this was relevant in the news, in July of 2019. In July of 2019, in the U.S. House of Representatives, they passed a bill asking the Inspector General of the Defense Department to conduct a review into whether the Pentagon experimented with ticks, bloodborne pathogens that ticks can carry, to use as biological weapons between 1950 and 1975. This amendment was put forward by Representative Chris Smith. He's a Republican from New Jersey who was convinced that this was the case. Okay, so where did this representative get it from? Well, he said he was inspired by several books and several research articles claiming that the U.S. government had conducted research at facilities known as Fort Derrick, which is in Maryland, Plum Island in New York, for this exact purpose. One of the books that Smith refers to is a book called Bitten: The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons. That book was authored and published by Stanford University science writer and former Lyme sufferer Chris Newby. And in that book, it features interviews with the scientist known as Willy Bergdorfer. Willy Bergdorfer is the man who discovered Lyme disease in ticks. Okay? And for his entire career, that man who discovered Lyme disease worked for the Department of Defense as a bioweapons specialist. And this is where we're getting to the conspiracy side of things. Lyme disease was discovered by a bioweapons specialist who worked for the Department of Defense. You can see where this is going. And the representative said the interviews combined with an access to Dr. Bergdorfer's lab files suggested that he and other bioweapons specialists experimented with ticks to see what kind of pathogens that they could be used to spread to either harm or slow down or kill enemy forces. And during all those studies, that's when they discover Lyme disease. Let me give you a quick breakdown of the tests that Dr. Bergdorfer did to find Lyme disease. In testing the blood of deer ticks, Bergdorfer did not find RMSF bacteria, which was actually the bacteria he was looking for when researching ticks, but he did find a spiral-shaped bacteria, which was called spirochetes. These were similar to what he had studied as a graduate student, were the cause of relapsing fever, which was one of the diseases that they were looking into using ticks to spread as a bioweapon. And he concluded that as spirochetes could cause relapsing fever, different types of spirochetes would cause other different diseases, and that's how he linked the cases of Lyme arthritis that were going around to this disease caused by these spirochetes from ticks. This discovery that he made was put into a paper which was published in the 1982 Science magazine. The paper was called Lyme Disease, a Tick-Borne Spirochetosis. Smith was also quoted saying, "There's just too much evidence for a reasonable man or woman to just turn the pages and say, put on your tinfoil hat, this is just conspiracy," Smith said. And yet, people with the credentials to look into this will say it's just a conspiracy theory, which begs the question, why would they even say that? The person who wrote the book, Newby, said that they cannot definitively link Lyme disease to U.S. military bioweapons efforts and research conducted at Fort Derrick. And they also said that their hypothesis was that they were trying to cover up bioweapon research, but they had no proof of that, just that they couldn't connect all the dots right now, but that their theory was it was genetically engineered. Another book he was talking about was called Six-Legged Soldiers Using Insects as Weapons of War, which was wrote by a person named Lockwood. And in that book, they offer definitive proof that the Army did conduct research on whether ticks could be used to spread tularemia, relapsing fever, and Colorado fever during the Cold War, in case they got into a war with the Soviet Union. But if you notice on there's nothing about the Lyme disease or the Lyme disease family. But despite these statements in his book, he's actually totally against that Lyme disease was one of the diseases considered to be spread by ticks. And he said that it's profoundly dubious that the U.S. military looked into using ticks to transmit Lyme disease. Why is this the case? Because ticks are not a good vector for transmitting disease, is what he said. They don't go very far, they stick near to their trees and brush, and on top of that, Lyme disease is a very slow-acting disease. It might make soldiers uncomfortable, but it would take months and months before it would even make them sick enough that they couldn't perform their duties, more than likely. They might be uncomfortable or even miserable, but it usually doesn't kill people. As the conspiracy theory goes, this wasn't present in the US. The US government was experimenting with it, possibly created it. The strain Borrelia burgdorferi, it gets out of the Plum Island Biological Warfare Lab and gets spread all over, and everybody gets it from these Ixodes ticks that were infested with it, and then it spread to other tick families, and then all the black-legged tick families from this point. But let's get into the facts and let's figure out that probably this isn't why Lyme disease is in the United States. To smooth out the timeline a little bit about the lab at Plum Island, this was repurposed from a military base to a lab in 1954 by the Agricultural Department to study exotic animal diseases. Lyme disease wasn't being worked on until 1981, which I would like to note was 12 years after 1969 when Richard Nixon outlawed the use of bioweapon research. So as far as like it escaping from the lab, the timeline just doesn't work. And on top of that, when you examine the different types of ticks in the different parts of the country that have Lyme disease, there's no significant difference between them. So if one was altered genetically to be a better bioweapon, there's absolutely no evidence of that in any of the tested ticks. There's ample evidence that both the ticks that carry Lyme disease and Lyme disease itself were present in the US not only before the Plum lab was ever established or research on any sort of ticks or Lyme disease was conducted by the US government. There's evidence that Lyme disease was all the way back in pre-Columbian times, so before Europeans even came over from Europe to the Americas, by thousands of years, from both by fossilized ticks and remains of animals that they found over the years. There's just a whole bunch of evidence that this disease has been on the continent for thousands of years. In a statement from Philip Baker, who's the executive director of the American Lyme Disease Foundation, he said that Smith was terribly informed when he introduced this bill. All of his claims were full of false and misleading information. But if we want to put some real nails in the coffin of this conspiracy theory, I've got a couple more pieces of evidence to present to you. Before Lyme disease was even discovered and named, there was cases that were later identified as Lyme disease in 1969 in Spooner, Wisconsin, and there was also cases in 1978 in Northern California that were later proved to have all been Lyme disease due to retesting saved samples from those patients. So that already proves that it was out in the wild before it was named and discovered by Willie, just out in the wild before it could have even had the chance to escape a lab. And not only that, scientists have been saving samples of ticks from different parts of the country since actually the 1940s. And there are samples from Long Island in 1945 that were retested and found to have Lyme disease present in them, and other samples that were from Cape Cod, and they were from 1896. So these samples were over 100 years old, and Lyme disease was present in these like 130-year-old ticks from Cape Cod. So that pretty much definitively proves that Lyme disease was already infested in ticks and spreading throughout the US way before the United States was ever testing them. And is it true that yes, the United States government did do tests on ticks to see if they could spread diseases and if that would be good as biological warfare before it was outlawed? And yes, the person doing that research, who was a DoD, Department of Defense, biochemical warfare scientist, he was the one that discovered Lyme disease, named Lyme disease, and discovered that type of spiral pathogen that he called spirochetes. So while all of that is true, the United States did not create Lyme disease. That just isn't true. There is no evidence that those ticks that they were testing ever escaped from the labs that they were working on this in. You know, I named the two labs earlier in the video. There's no evidence that either of those labs ever had any tick samples escape that were infested with any type of disease. And above that, this disease was already rampantly spreading all throughout the country years before these labs were ever created or the DoD ever commissioned research into whether ticks or other bugs could be used to spread diseases. Another thing about Lyme disease is they're actually currently testing a vaccine to work against Lyme disease that would prevent people who get tick bites from contracting Lyme disease. This trial is currently going on in Maine. Maine usually has around 2,000 to 3,000 cases of Lyme disease that show symptoms every single year, and Pfizer is running this vaccine trial over the next 13 months. So by the time it's 2026, we might have a vaccine that can immunize against Lyme disease, as it's already in the stage 3 of human trials. And if this trial is successful at proving that it prevents the contraction of Lyme disease, we might have a solution to this awful disease. That's all I got for you today. That's the video. Unfortunately, yes, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is wrong, and the Representative Smith, he is also wrong. They were both wrong on these assumptions. While the DoD did research into ticks and Lyme disease, they didn't create Lyme disease, and they didn't spread it intentionally or accidentally. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next Friday. Bye. I love you.